An empty canteen tells you everything about this war before a single fact does. Between 1932 and 1935, Bolivia and Paraguay fought over the Gran Chaco, 250,000 square miles of thorn scrub, cracked earth, and swamp that most maps of the era barely bothered to name accurately. The dispute traces back further than either army, to 1884, when Chile crushed Bolivia in the War of the Pacific and annexed its entire Pacific coastline. Bolivia never accepted the loss of the sea, and for the next 5 decades, officials in La Paz searched for another way out, a river route through the Gran Chaco toward the Rio de la Plata and the Atlantic beyond it. Standard Oil had already staked concessions along Bolivia's eastern frontier by the late 1920s, and that alone was enough to convince a landlocked nation that the empty ground ahead of it was worth almost any cost. Paraguay had nothing comparable to offer in return: a population barely a third the size of Bolivia's, and an economy still recovering from a catastrophic war fought 60 years earlier. But the Chaco was the only frontier Paraguay had left to defend, and its leaders treated the border as non-negotiable regardless of the odds against them. Both nations, in fact, had laid formal claim to this same stretch of scrub since 1825, more than a century before either side had the weapons or the will to fight over it seriously. The first real spark came in December 1928, when Paraguayan cavalry overran a Bolivian outpost called Fort Vanguardia, burning its huts to the ground and capturing more than 20 prisoners in the process. Bolivia answered within days, seizing a fort of its own named Boquerón and killing 15 Paraguayan soldiers, a name and a location the war would return to with far greater consequence 4 years later. International mediators in Washington, D.C. forced both governments back to their original positions by September 1929, and for a moment, full-scale war seemed to have been avoided entirely. But the truce settled nothing underneath it. Both nations spent the next 3 years quietly rearming, ordering rifles, artillery, and aircraft from foreign suppliers on credit they could barely afford, each one certain the other intended to strike first the moment it felt ready. War became official on June 15, 1932, when Bolivian troops seized a Paraguayan post at a place called Carlos Antonio Lopez, sparking a chain reaction neither government fully controlled after that point. On paper, Bolivia looked unbeatable. It fielded 3 times Paraguay's population, artillery and tanks purchased through loans from American banks, and an army trained for over a decade by Hans Kunt, a German general who had served on the Western Front in the First World War and later helped rebuild Bolivia's officer corps from scratch. Bolivia moved fast, using its rail network to shift men and artillery toward the front within weeks of the first shots being fired. Paraguay had no such infrastructure to lean on. José Félix Estigarribia, its field commander, had to build a functioning army almost entirely from civilian volunteers, calling ordinary townspeople into uniform with barely any formal training behind them. It's worth remembering just how far Paraguay had to climb to get there. As recently as 1924, its entire military numbered 2,381 soldiers, 131 officers, 37 cannon, and 26 machine guns, figures that made the country's wartime mobilization look almost impossible from the outside looking in. None of these numbers meant much once both armies actually reached the Chaco itself. Thorn forests thick enough to tear uniforms apart swallowed roads that barely existed to begin with, and daytime heat regularly climbed past 40 degrees Celsius across ground with almost no shade anywhere. Bolivia's infantry was overwhelmingly Aymara and Quechua, conscripts pulled down from 12,000 feet of thin, cold Andean air and thrown without acclimatization into suffocating lowland heat their bodies had never encountered before. Paraguay's soldiers, many of them Guarani, had grown up in exactly this terrain, and it showed immediately. They knew which patches of ground held water after the rains and which ones never would, knowledge no manual could teach a Highland conscript in weeks. Soldiers on both sides started calling the region the Green Hell almost as soon as they arrived in it, and for hundreds of miles in every direction, there was no road worth the name to move anything through it quickly. As dust trails from both armies' columns rose and converged across the horizon that summer, the Chaco itself, not either government's war plan, was already deciding how this war would actually be fought. The war's first real test came at a fort called Boquerón, defended by fewer than 500 Bolivian soldiers dug in behind a simple wooden palisade. Estigarribia decided to end the standoff decisively, committing 7,500 Paraguayan troops to the assault starting on September 9, 1932. What followed was not a quick battle but a siege that dragged on for nearly 3 weeks, far longer than either side had planned for going in. The Bolivian garrison held its ground with a stubbornness that surprised Paraguayan commanders, trading rifle fire from cramped trenches day after day without relief. Paraguayan troops cut the fort off from every water source within the first days of the siege, and from that point forward, thirst did more damage to the defenders than any bullet reaching them from outside the walls. Bolivia dispatched a relief column of 3,500 men to break through and resupply the garrison before it collapsed entirely. Inside the fort itself, supplies of food, ammunition, and drinking water dwindled by the hour, and wounded soldiers were laid among crates that held almost nothing left to give them. The relief column never closed the distance in time, halting short of the fort as darkness fell with the siege still unbroken around it. On September 29, the garrison finally surrendered, 2,200 Bolivian soldiers killed, wounded, sick, or taken prisoner, against roughly 500 Paraguayan dead in return. It was Paraguay's first major victory of the entire war, and its significance reached far beyond the fort's modest walls. A nation that had fielded barely 2,000 soldiers on its entire army roster only 8 years earlier had just defeated Bolivia's German-trained, better supplied force in a straight siege. News of Boquerón spread through both countries within days of the surrender. In Paraguay, it became proof the war could actually be won. In Bolivia, it became the first visible crack in a strategy that had assumed victory was simply a matter of numbers, arms, and German training, a plan the empty, abandoned battlefield left behind now openly contradicted. 1933 should have taught Bolivia something valuable about attacking fortified ground in this terrain. Instead, it became a year of repeating the exact same mistake at a steadily rising cost in lives. At a position called Nanawa, Paraguayan engineers built a genuinely modern defensive line, deep trenches, barbed wire, interlocking machine gun positions, and Kunt responded by ordering Bolivian infantry to charge directly into it, first in January and then again in July, with nearly identical results both times. Each assault broke apart against defenses that should never have been attacked head-on by infantry alone, and casualty telegrams began piling up on Kunt's desk faster than the Highlands could send replacements to the front. Back in La Paz, President Daniel Salamanca watched the reports arrive and grew convinced that his own celebrated general was bleeding the Bolivian army to death for ground that never actually changed hands. The argument between the two men turned bitter enough to paralyze strategic decision-making at exactly the moment the war most needed a change of direction. Paraguay formally declared war on May 10, 1933, a legal formality, really, for a conflict that had already been raging without interruption for nearly a year by that point. But behind every battle report from this period sat a quieter, more decisive crisis that mattered more than any single assault. Water in the Chaco had to be trucked to the front lines from fixed sources, often over enormous distances, and neither country ever had enough trucks or fuel to keep those convoys reliable. When a convoy broke down on roadless, rutted ground, or was ambushed by guerrilla patrols along the way, entire units simply ran dry within days. Soldiers who had survived direct artillery fire and rifle assaults were now dying of thirst within sight of their own lines, crowding around whatever wells still held water until there was nothing left in them to draw. This war already had an unofficial name circulating quietly among the men fighting it by the end of 1933, and by every account from the front, that name, the War of Thirst, was proving more accurate with each passing month than any tally of rifles, divisions, or captured ground. A completely dried waterhole could kill just as efficiently in the Chaco as any weapon either army carried into it. Some Bolivian units, cut off and out of options, surrendered outright in exchange for nothing more than a single cup of water rather than continue fighting for ground they could no longer physically hold. Paraguay's supply lines, by comparison, ran with something close to mechanical reliability, mulecart convoys moving water barrels forward on schedules that Bolivian logistics officers could only envy from a distance. When the rainy season arrived between March and October, conditions flipped entirely, the same parched ground turned to marsh, and mosquito-borne disease filled field hospitals almost as fast as combat wounds did, adding a second front neither side had planned to fight on at all. Look closely at any single Bolivian conscript from this period and the whole war is visible in one face, exhausted, dust-caked, staring toward a horizon he had no say in choosing. A Paraguayan soldier from the same year tells the opposite story just as clearly, alert and entirely unbothered by terrain that was actively killing his enemy around him. High above both of them, this war produced one strange footnote almost by accident, the last confirmed dogfight fought between biplanes in the history of aerial combat, a genuine curiosity buried inside an otherwise grinding, attritional conflict. On the ground, though, there was very little movement to speak of through most of 1933, the front lines simply sat facing each other across open scrub for months, neither army able to break the stalemate without repeating Nanawa's costly mistake. Newspapers in La Paz ran the mounting casualty figures on their front pages with growing regularity, feeding public anger that would eventually reach the highest levels of Bolivia's government. In Asunción, market stalls sat rationed and half-empty under wartime shortages of their own, proof that the strain of this war was cutting into daily life on both sides of the border, regardless of who currently held the advantage on the battlefield itself. By 1934, Bolivia's high command had finally run out of patience with Hans Kunt, and he was formally relieved of a post he had held since long before the war began. His removal ended, at least officially, the doctrine of costly frontal assault that had defined Bolivia's strategy for nearly 2 years straight. Yrendagüé used the change to introduce something considerably smarter on the Paraguayan side, wide encircling maneuvers designed to trap entire Bolivian units far from their water supply, rather than attacking their strongest defended positions directly. In August 1934, he staged an elaborate feint toward Bolivia's oil fields at Santa Cruz, a target he had no genuine intention of taking at all. The deception worked almost perfectly. 12,000 Bolivian troops were shifted 275 miles away to defend against a threat that didn't actually exist, leaving Yrendagüé's real objective dangerously exposed. On the night of August 14, Paraguayan forces captured 7,000 Bolivian soldiers in a single coordinated encirclement, one of the largest mass captures of the entire war. 2 days later, on August 16, the real target of the whole operation, Bolivia's critical supply hub at Bolivian on the Pilcomayo River, fell outright. 8,000 Bolivian soldiers died in that one engagement alone, and roughly $3 million worth of munitions fell into Paraguayan hands along with it, carefully tallied by quartermasters moving through the captured position afterward. News of the twin disasters at Bolivian reached La Paz within days, and for the first time since the war began, senior Bolivian officials openly questioned whether victory was still achievable at all. By the close of 1934, the momentum that had unquestionably belonged to Bolivia for the war's first 2 years had visibly and irreversibly changed hands, and officers on both sides could feel it happening even before the official casualty figures caught up with what was already obvious on the ground. November 1934 brought the single cruelest siege of the entire war. At a position called El Carmen, Paraguayan troops seized the surrounding wells before the Bolivian garrison station there even realized it had been cut off from its own water supply entirely. 4,000 men found themselves trapped inside a closing perimeter for 4 consecutive days, with no way to break out and no way to resupply from outside. When the survivors finally surrendered on November 17, 2,600 of them were already dead, not from Paraguayan bullets, but from thirst, having died within sight of water sources they could no longer physically reach. Only about 2,000 men escaped the encirclement before it fully closed around the rest of the garrison. Bolivia's 2nd Reserve Division attempted to break through Paraguayan lines to reach the trapped garrison, succeeded briefly, and then found itself surrounded in exactly the same way almost immediately afterward. In a decision that compounded the disaster further, Bolivia stripped troops away from Bolivian's own defenses to attempt a relief march toward El Carmen and lost both positions on the very same day as a direct result. Paraguayan strength on this front now outnumbered Bolivia's by more than 2 to 1, 35,000 men against roughly 15,000. Weeks later, at a place called Yrendagüé, the same pattern repeated with even greater consequence. Paraguayan troops seized the wells there before an elite Bolivian cavalry corps, a unit once considered the finest in the entire army, could return from a failed advance toward a nearby position called Paquiba. The exhausted, thirsty riders arrived to find nothing waiting for them, and the unit simply came apart in the surrounding forest. Men scattered in every direction searching for water that didn't exist, and a great many of those who avoided capture that day died anyway, of thirst and exposure, wandering through terrain that had already killed thousands of their countrymen the exact same way. By December 1934, Paraguayan forces stood just 30 miles from Villa Montes, the critical supply hub protecting Bolivia's remaining oil interests, and for the first time in over 2 years, Bolivia's entire war effort appeared genuinely close to collapse. Bolivian defenders dug in around the position with everything they had left to give, fully aware that losing Villa Montes likely meant losing the war outright and permanently. In February 1935, Paraguay attempted to press its advantage and stormed the position directly, and failed. For the first time since the war began, Paraguay was now the side fighting on unfamiliar terrain, stretched far beyond its own reliable water and supply lines after 2 straight years of steady advance. Bolivian defenders, holding shorter supply lines for once, took full advantage of the reversal and held their ground through the assault without breaking. Both national treasuries were nearing complete exhaustion by this point, war debt piling up faster than either government could realistically manage without outside help from neighbors. Diplomats from neighboring South American states began gathering in Buenos Aires that spring, applying steady pressure on both governments to end a war that had bankrupted them both without producing a clear winner either way. Delegates spent weeks drafting ceasefire language that neither exhausted army could afford to reject outright, no matter how each side privately felt about the terms on offer. On the morning of June 12, 1935, a ceasefire was finally agreed upon by both governments, set to take formal effect 2 days later. In the final half hour before that ceasefire actually took hold, the two armies exchanged one last, genuinely pointless volley of gunfire across the line. It was a strange, almost anticlimactic way for a war this costly to end, not with a decisive final battle, but with exhaustion on both sides simply running out at roughly the same moment. When the guns finally fell silent, Paraguay held most of the territory both nations had spent 3 years fighting over, its forward positions sitting just 15 kilometers from Bolivia's remaining oil fields. 3 years later, in 1938, delegates from both countries returned to Buenos Aires to convert the temporary ceasefire into a permanent peace agreement. The resulting treaty awarded Paraguay roughly 3/4 of the entire Chaco boreal outright, formalizing gains its army had already secured on the battlefield years earlier. Bolivia retained a narrow corridor of access to the Paraguay River, along with a small port at Puerto Bush, a modest version of the outlet to the water it had gone to war seeking in the first place. Behind the treaty's formal language sat the war's real cost, one historians still argue over because the scale is genuinely difficult to accept: close to 100,000 dead in total, roughly 2 Paraguayans and 3 Bolivians lost for every single square mile of territory that ultimately changed hands. In Bolivia, veterans returning home to a war that had cost so much and settled so little fed years of political unrest that followed almost immediately after the treaty was signed. Paraguay's own post-war years brought a string of coups and instability that eventually produced a decades-long dictatorship under Alfredo Stroessner, one of the war's more distant and unexpected legacies. Ordinary soldiers on both sides simply walked home to towns and villages that had gone on largely without them, carrying injuries and memories that outlasted any formal peace agreement by decades. And in a detail historians would only untangle much later, Standard Oil's actual wartime role turned out to be almost the opposite of its reputation. The company had mostly refused to cooperate with Bolivia's military at all, meaning the popular oil war narrative attached to this conflict was largely a myth assembled well after the fighting had already ended. The oil both nations spent 3 years and 100,000 lives fighting over was never actually found beneath the disputed ground, not for another 77 years afterward. In 2012, Paraguayan officials announced genuine reserves along the Purity River, discovered decades too late to matter to any of the men who died looking for exactly this. Today, Paraguay's share of the Chaco supports vast cattle ranches generating billions in export revenue every year, while Bolivia's portion feeds natural gas fields that now power roughly half the country's energy needs, the same stretch of land, finally put to use, just not the use either army imagined while fighting over it decades earlier. This remains the last high-casualty war fought anywhere in the Americas, a distinction that says something genuinely uncomfortable about how thoroughly it has since been forgotten outside the two countries that actually fought it. Simple stone markers, mostly half-buried in grass by now, are what remain to show where entire divisions once disappeared within days of each other. The border that thousands of men died defending or attacking is today nothing more than an ordinary faded line on a map neither government disputes anymore. The two nations formally resolved their last remaining boundary questions in 2009, jointly acknowledging that outside interests had helped inflame a dispute that was never really about oil to begin with. Old trench systems that once held tens of thousands of men have mostly vanished back into scrub that carries no memory of what happened on top of it. The same derrick that once seemed to justify all of this now stands dwarfed by open grassland that has no particular interest in it either. As the light fades over the Chaco tonight, there's nothing left standing here that was ever actually worth what it cost. It's a quiet, almost anticlimactic ending for a war that once seemed to demand so much from so many, but perhaps that quiet is the most honest monument the Chaco could ever offer.